The letter arrived on a Tuesday, creased and dusty from its journey across 3 territories, and Monroe Calloway read it twice before he let himself believe what it was asking of him. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Redemption, Texas sat baking under a sky the color of hammered copper. Monroe had lived there for 6 years, long enough to know every face and every grudge and every secret that the dust kept half buried on Main Street. He ran the livery stable that his father had left him, and he was 31 years old, and he had not yet found a woman willing to make a life in a place that smelled of horse and iron and too much sun. That last part was his own fault, or so people told him, because Monroe Calloway was not an easy man to reach. He was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, and most people mistook that stillness for coldness, and most women moved on before they ever thought to look beneath it. The letter was from a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Pierce in Abilene, Kansas, and she wrote on behalf of a young woman in her care. The handwriting was careful and educated, the kind that schoolteachers produce, and Mrs. Pierce explained that the young woman's name was Frances Lockhart, that she was 23 years of age, that she had been orphaned at 17 when her father died of a fever and her mother had gone 2 years before that, and that she was now in need of a husband because the rooming house where she had been living as a boarder and occasional seamstress had been sold to a man who did not allow female lodgers. And the options available to Frances Lockhart in Abilene were narrowing in ways that Mrs. Pierce did not spell out but which Monroe understood perfectly well, because he was not a naive man. What made Monroe set the letter down and stare at the wall of his office for a long moment was what Mrs. Pierce wrote in the final paragraph. She wrote, "I must be honest with you, Mr. Calloway, as I believe honesty serves everyone better than pleasant deception. Frances Lockhart is not an easy woman to describe to a stranger. She is not biddable. She is not soft-spoken. She has opinions on matters that most women of her station are not expected to have opinions about, and she shares those opinions freely and without apology. She has been described as fierce and ungovernable in every letter written on her behalf by the previous gentlemen callers I have contacted, and I am aware that this recommendation does not serve her well. But I would rather you know the truth of her than arrive expecting a different woman. She is hardworking and loyal and brave in ways that I find admirable, even when they cause me considerable frustration. If you are the kind of man who wants a wife who will not question him, then I urge you to look elsewhere. But if you are the kind of man who wants a partner, then Frances Lockhart may be the finest one I have ever had the privilege of knowing." Monroe read that paragraph 3 times. Then he walked to the small desk in the corner of his office, found a sheet of paper, dipped his pen, and wrote one word on it. Yes. He folded it, addressed it to Mrs. Adelaide Pierce in Abilene, Kansas, and walked it down to the post office himself before he could change his mind, which he did not want to do but which a more cautious man might have done. He did not tell anyone in Redemption what he had done until 3 weeks later, when the arrangement had been confirmed by return letter, and by then it was too late for the town's opinions to matter, though they offered them anyway. The barber, Hector Plum, said he had heard that women from Abilene were a rough sort, and that Monroe ought to be careful. The general store owner, a widow named Cora Hensley, said she thought it was terribly romantic, and that she hoped the girl would be kind. The sheriff, a lean man named Roy Dade who had known Monroe since boyhood, said only that he hoped Monroe knew what he was getting himself into. Monroe said he did not entirely, and that was part of what interested him. Frances Lockhart arrived on the afternoon stage on the 14th of June, 1878, and Monroe was standing outside the stage depot with his hat in his hands and a feeling in his chest that he could not entirely name. The stage door opened, and 2 men climbed down, and then a woman appeared in the doorway and stepped down onto the dust of Redemption's Main Street, and Monroe understood immediately why no man before him had sent back a yes. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5'8", with dark hair pinned up under a hat that had clearly seen better days, and a jaw set like she was expecting a fight, and had decided she would not be the one to back down from it. Her dress was clean but plain, the kind of plain that comes from practicality rather than poverty, and she carried a single leather traveling bag that she had clearly not let the stage driver handle for her. Her eyes were the color of good creek water, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on the light, and they found Monroe immediately and assessed him the way a person assesses something they are not sure they can trust yet. He put his hat back on his head because standing there holding it suddenly felt foolish, and he walked toward her. "Miss Lockhart," he said. "Mr. Calloway," she said, and her voice was lower than he had expected, steady and direct. "You are taller than I imagined." "You are exactly as I imagined," he said, and then immediately wondered if that was the right thing to say, but she tilted her head slightly and something behind her eyes shifted from guarded to curious. "Mrs. Pierce described you as reliable and decent," she said. "She did not mention you had any particular gift for conversation." "I do not," he said honestly. "Are you hungry? The hotel dining room serves a reasonable supper." She looked at him for a moment longer, as if she were reading something written on him that most people could not see, and then she said, "I am starving, Mr. Calloway. I have been on that stage for 2 days, and the food at the last stop was inedible." He took her bag before she could stop him, and she made a sound of protest and reached for it, and he said, "I am not taking it because I think you cannot carry it. I am taking it because you have been on a stage for 2 days and my hands are empty and yours are not." There was a pause. "That is a reasonable explanation," she said. They walked to the hotel dining room, and he ordered coffee and she ordered coffee, and they ate beef stew and cornbread. And she asked him 3 questions that no woman had ever asked him before in their first hour of acquaintance. She asked him what he thought was the hardest part of running a business in a town the size of Redemption. She asked him whether he believed a woman ought to be allowed to own property in her own name, and when he said he thought she ought to be, if she had the means to purchase it, Frances Lockhart looked at him with an expression he would later learn was her version of surprise, which in another person would have been a dropped jaw, but in Frances was merely a slight widening of those gray-green eyes. She asked him whether he expected her to stop having opinions once they were married. He said, "I would not know what to do with a woman who had none." She set down her fork. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I have been called ungovernable by 4 men who wrote letters about me to women who were trying to find me a husband. I have been told that I am too much. I am telling you this now so that you hear it from me rather than from someone in this town who will eventually hear the story. I read Mrs. Pierce's letter," he said, "all of it, and you still sent back a yes." "I did. Why?" He considered the question seriously, because she was clearly a woman who would know the difference between a genuine answer and a flattering one. "Because the man who is frightened by a woman with opinions is not the kind of man I want to be," he said. "And because I have been alone for a long time, and I would rather build something with someone real than wait for someone convenient." Frances Lockhart looked at him for a long time across the supper table in the hotel dining room of Redemption, Texas, with the sounds of the street coming through the window and the smell of coffee between them. "I am real," she said. "I know," he said. They did not fall in love at that table on that evening, because love does not work that way, and both of them were too practical to pretend otherwise. But something began there, something that had the density and the weight of a thing that intends to last. They were married 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, in the small Baptist church on the eastern edge of Redemption, with the Reverend Thomas Holt officiating and Cora Hensley and Roy Dade standing as witnesses. Frances wore a dress that Cora had helped her press, a pale blue that made her eyes look more green than gray, and she stood beside Monroe with her chin up and her hands steady, and she said her vows in a clear voice that carried to the back of the church without effort. Monroe said his in a voice that was quieter, because he was a quieter man, but his eyes did not leave her face for the duration of it. Afterward, Cora Hensley cried a little, and Roy Dade shook Monroe's hand and said, She looks like she means every word she says. Monroe said, I believe she does. They ate supper at the hotel again that evening, because the hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Redemption, and Frances ordered apple pie and ate every bite of it, and said it was the second best apple pie she had ever eaten in her life, the first having been made by a woman in Abilene named Mrs. Delgado, who put cinnamon in the crust, and Monroe listened to her talk about Mrs. Delgado's pie with the attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting, which Frances noticed without saying anything about it then. They walked home to his house, their house, as of that morning, through the evening air, which was warm and smelled of dry grass and the distant possibility of rain, and when they reached the porch, Monroe opened the door and then looked at her. I can carry you over the threshold if you would like, he said, or I can simply hold the door. I do not have a strong opinion either way. Frances looked at him with that slight widening of the eyes that he was beginning to recognize as her surprise, and then she did something he had not yet seen her do. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it transformed her face entirely, and Monroe felt something in his chest loosen in a way it had not loosened in years. Carry me, she said. I would like to see if you can manage it without embarrassing us both. He could, and he did, and she was still laughing when he set her down inside the front room of the house, and they stood there for a moment in the lantern light, closer than they had been before, and the laughter faded into something quieter and warmer. Thank you, she said softly, and it was clear she did not mean only for the carrying. You are welcome, he said, and it was clear he understood what she meant. The first month of their marriage was a careful and interesting negotiation, and Monroe found himself fascinated by the woman who had come to share his house in a way that had nothing to do with the practical arrangements of matrimony and everything to do with Frances herself. She was not a woman who did things halfway. When she decided to take over the kitchen garden, she rebuilt it entirely, expanding it and adding beds and negotiating with the general store for seeds with a combination of logic and persuasion that left Cora Hensley slightly dazed and Monroe quietly amused. When she decided to learn the workings of the livery stable, she showed up on a Thursday morning in her work clothes and told Monroe she wanted to understand what he did, and she spent 3 hours learning the names of every horse and the particulars of their habits, and she did not flinch when a gray gelding named Thomas tried to take a bite out of her hat. He does that to most people, Monroe said. Then he and I will need to reach an understanding, Frances said, and she held out her hand, palm flat, and waited with the patience of a woman who had nowhere more important to be, until Thomas grudgingly sniffed it, and then turned away with an air of decided indifference that Frances appeared to take as progress. She was also, Monroe discovered, a woman who could not sleep immediately after coming to bed. She would lie still for perhaps 20 minutes and then, if sleep had not taken her, she would get up and light a candle and sit at the small table by the window and read or write. And the first few times this happened, Monroe woke to find her gone and felt a hollow thing where she had been. He came to the table one night in the 3rd week of their marriage, and sat down across from her without saying anything. She was writing a letter to Mrs. Pierce, and she looked up when he sat down and there was a question in her eyes. I thought there might be room enough for 2 people at this table, he said. She considered him in the candlelight. You do not have to keep me company, she said. I am used to being awake at night. It has never particularly troubled me. It does not trouble me either, he said. I simply prefer being where you are. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said most things, and Frances set down her pen and looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed in a way that was subtle and significant. Monroe, she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without the prefix, and they both noticed it. Frances, he said. She picked her pen back up and continued writing, but she moved the candle slightly so the light fell more evenly between them, and Monroe found a week old newspaper on the shelf and sat reading it in the warm circle of that shared light, and neither of them spoke for an hour, and it was one of the most comfortable hours Monroe could remember in a very long time. In the mornings, she made coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she brought him a cup before he left for the stable, and she leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen in the early light, looking entirely at home in a way that made the house feel different to him, fuller and more purposeful. He began to bring her small things. A late-season wildflower he found growing in the crack of a fence post, a smooth stone from the creek that was the exact same gray-green as her eyes, a paper of horehound candy from the general store because he had heard her mention once that she liked it. She received each of these things with an expression that was trying very hard not to be moved and failing in small, beautiful ways that she would have been annoyed to know he could see. In the second month of their marriage, trouble arrived in redemption in the form of a man named Dawson Hale. Dawson Hale was not an unusual type for that era and that landscape. He was a land speculator, which in 1878 Texas meant a man who had money and lawyers, and a willingness to use both in ways that the law permitted even when common decency did not. He had been buying up property along the creek that ran through the valley east of Redemption, and the business was proceeding smoothly until he decided that the 3 small farms adjacent to the creek were the key to his plan, and 2 of those farms had owners who were willing to sell, and 1 did not. The one that did not was owned by an elderly man named Silas Greer, who had been farming that land since 1861, and who had no intention of leaving it for any price that Dawson Hale was willing to offer, which was a figure Silas considered insultingly low and Hale considered more than generous. Silas Greer was also, as it happened, a man Monroe Calloway had known since childhood. Silas was 64 years old, and he had been a friend of Monroe's father, and he had given Monroe his first real work when Monroe was 14, and Monroe had a loyalty to him that went well past the ordinary. Dawson Hale came to Monroe's livery stable on a Wednesday morning and asked, with the smooth courtesy of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, whether Monroe might use his influence with Silas Greer to encourage the old man to be more reasonable. Monroe said he would not do that. Hale's courtesy developed a sharp edge, and he said he thought Monroe might want to reconsider. Monroe said he had considered it, and his answer remained the same. Hale left, and that evening Monroe told Frances about it at the supper table. He told her matter-of-factly, the way he told her most things without dramatizing it, but he watched her face as he talked and watched the set of her jaw shift into something harder. "He is trying to use you as a lever against an old man," she said. "Yes. What does he actually want the land for? There is talk of a rail spur coming through the valley. If he owns the water rights and the land along the creek, he controls access to the only reliable water source for 10 miles in either direction." Frances was quiet for a moment, pushing her fork through the beans on her plate. "That affects more than just Silas Greer," she said. "It does. It affects you. Your business. Anyone who runs cattle or farms anywhere in this valley." "Yes," she looked at him. "Have you spoken to Roy Dade about this?" "Roy is the sheriff of Redemption. What Hale is doing is not against the law. It is against the interests of this entire community," Frances said, and her voice had that quality it got when she had decided something, a particular steadiness that Monroe had come to recognize as the sound of her mind working at full force. "There must be something that can be done." "I am open to suggestions," Monroe said. Frances set her fork down and folded her hands on the table. "Tell me everything you know about Dawson Hale," she said. "And tell me exactly what the law says about water rights in this county." Monroe looked at her across the table and felt something he recognized now as the feeling he got when Frances Lockhart was about to do something remarkable. "I will tell you what I know," he said, "and Roy Dade may be able to fill in the rest." What followed over the next 2 weeks was a campaign that Monroe would later describe to Roy Dade as the most organized thing he had ever witnessed, and that Roy Dade would later describe to his wife as the moment he understood why Monroe Calloway had sent back a yes. Frances started by visiting every farmer and rancher in the valley, riding out on the road with Monroe when she could, and borrowing a horse from the stable on the days when Monroe could not accompany her. She listened to people. She asked questions. She made notes in a small leather journal that she carried in her coat pocket, and she built, with the care and precision of a woman who understood that information was the most useful tool available to her, a picture of what Dawson Hale actually intended to do. She also found, in the course of her visits, that 3 families had already received pressure from Hale's men to sell pressure that went beyond words and into the territory of cut fences and missing livestock, and the kind of subtle damage that cannot be easily traced to a single source, but which tells a very clear story to the people who experience it. She brought this information to Roy Dade. Roy Dade listened to Frances Lockhart lay out the pattern of Hale's activities with the systematic clarity of a woman who had organized her evidence the way a general organizes a battle, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "that is a more thorough accounting than anything I have managed to put together." "I spoke with the Ramos family at the north end of the valley," Frances said. "They had a barn damaged 2 weeks ago, and they did not report it because they were afraid. They are afraid because they cannot afford to leave and they cannot afford to fight. There are at least 2 other families in the same position." Roy Dade looked at Monroe, who was standing by the wall with his arms folded, and an expression that was somewhere between pride and something warmer and more complicated. "What are you asking me to do, Mrs. Calloway?" Roy said. "I am asking you to document it," Frances said. "If there is a pattern of harassment connected to a land acquisition scheme, then there is a record. And if there is a record, then when Hale's lawyers arrive with their papers, we have something to set against them." Roy Dade ran a hand through his hair. "Dawson Hale has money and lawyers," he said. "Yes," said Frances, "and we have neighbors and the truth." The next week, Frances organized what she called a valley meeting, which was the kind of straightforwardly democratic thing that the people of that era and place understood and respected. A gathering in the open yard behind the Baptist church where everyone who had a stake in the matter could come and speak and be heard. 63 people came, which was more than Monroe had expected and exactly as many as Frances had predicted, because she had spent a week making sure that every family in the valley knew about it and understood that their presence mattered. Monroe stood at her side through all of it, and he watched her speak to a room full of hard-working, worried people with a clarity and a passion that held everyone still, and he felt something in his chest that he had been carefully not naming for several weeks now, because naming it felt like a significant step, and Monroe was a man who was cautious about significant steps. She was not a practiced speaker in the sense of having formal training, but she had the rare and more valuable gift of saying exactly what she meant in exactly the words that people could hear. And the Valley meeting produced a collective agreement to document every instance of pressure or damage and report it to Roy Dade, and to stand together against any attempt to rush anyone into a sale, and to pool resources to pay for a lawyer of their own if it came to that. It did come to that, eventually, though not as quickly as Dawson Hale had intended, because the organized resistance of 63 families who had decided that their home was worth defending proved considerably harder to manage than a collection of isolated individuals, and by the time autumn came to redemption, Hale had revised his plans significantly. He had purchased the 2 farms whose owners had been willing to sell, but without the Greer property and without the cooperation of the larger valley community, his plans for controlling the water access did not hold together the way he had designed them. He came to Monroe one final time in October, and he said he had a proposition. Monroe said he was not interested in propositions from Dawson Hale. Hale said that was a shame, and left, and within 2 months he had moved on to a different territory where the opportunities were less complicated. Silas Greer came to Monroe's house the Sunday after Hale's final departure to tell Monroe that he was grateful, and Monroe told him that Frances was the one who deserved his gratitude, and Silas Greer shook Frances's hand with both of his and said she was the finest woman he had had the honor of meeting in 20 years. Frances said she was glad she could help, and after Silas left, Monroe found her standing at the kitchen window looking out at the garden with her arms crossed, and a faint color in her cheeks that he had learned was how emotion showed in her when she was trying not to show it otherwise. He stood beside her at the window. "That was something to be proud of," he said. "It was something that needed doing," she said, in a voice that was slightly rougher than usual. Those families did not have anyone to stand up for them, and they should not have had to face that alone. "No," he said, "they should not have." She turned to look at him. They were close, standing side by side, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at that particular angle it had in October in Texas, golden and long and low. "Monroe," she said. He said, "Frances." And then, in the same careful way that he had laid flowers on her windowsill and brought her horehound candy and moved a lantern closer so she could read, he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there at the kitchen window with the afternoon light on them and the garden outside looking exactly like a place that was being tended by two people who intended to stay. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not the kind of moment that gets written about in the popular novels of the era, but it was real, and it was the moment that Monroe Calloway finally let himself name the thing that had been growing in him since the afternoon she stepped off the stage and looked at him like she was deciding whether he was worth trusting. He was in love with Frances Lockhart. He was, more precisely, in love with Frances Calloway, and the weight of that name felt like something solid and trustworthy and completely right. He did not say it that afternoon at the window, because Monroe was a man who wanted to say it properly when he said it, and the time did not feel right yet. November came to redemption and brought with it the particular beauty of a Texas autumn, which is not the spectacular flaming color of the eastern states, but is its own kind of lovely, a quieter thing of tan grasses and wide skies, and the occasional stands of cottonwood along the creek going pale gold. Frances loved it. She walked out into the evenings and stood at the edge of the porch and watched the sky change colors, and Monroe watched her from the doorway and thought that she was the most alive person he had ever been in the same room with. She had also, over the months since her arrival, become a person in redemption in her own right. She had helped Cora Hensley reorganize the general store's inventory system. She had started teaching letters twice a week to the children of two families who could not afford the schoolhouse fees, using the kitchen table and a spare chalkboard she had obtained from the school when it upgraded. She had become, in the particular way that people with strong characters become things in small towns, known and valued and necessary. The women of redemption had not always been sure what to make of Frances Lockhart when she arrived. There was a period, in those first weeks, when some of them found her directness disconcerting and her opinions occasionally too present. But Frances was not aggressive. She was genuine, and she had the gift of being genuinely interested in other people. And most people, when they feel genuinely seen and heard, find it very difficult to remain wary. Cora Hensley had been her first real friend in town, and that friendship had become one of the constants of Frances's life in redemption. They had Sunday afternoon coffee together with a regularity that had become a fixture of their weeks, and Monroe was glad for it, because he knew Frances had left a life in Abilene that had its own connections and its own texture, and building new ones took time and intention. On the last Sunday of November, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, Monroe came home from the stable in the late afternoon to find Frances sitting at the table with Cora's recent letter spread before her and an expression on her face that was quieter than her usual. "Is everything all right?" he said, pausing in the doorway. She looked up. "My friend Mrs. Delgado," she said, "the one with the apple pie, she has died." He came inside and sat down across from her. "I am sorry," he said. "She was not old," Frances said. "She was only 50. A fever, Cora says. She died in 2 days." Monroe did not say anything. He knew Frances well enough by now to know that she did not always want words. Sometimes she wanted the presence of someone who would sit with her in the difficult moments without trying to manage them. Frances folded the letter. "She was kind to me," she said. "After my father died when I was 17 and there was so much uncertainty, she used to have me to supper on Sundays. She said a person needed one dependable thing in a week, and that supper on Sunday with good company was as dependable as she could manage." "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing," Monroe said. "She was." Frances was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad I am here, Monroe. I am glad I came." He looked at her across the table. The last of the November light was coming through the window, and it caught the dark of her hair and the green in her eyes. "So am I," he said, and then, because the moment had a quality that he recognized as the right kind of moment, he said, "I love you." It was not elegant. He had been planning something better, something with more ceremony, but the words simply arrived and he let them. Frances looked at him, and there was a long silence that Monroe spent not quite breathing. "I have been trying," she said slowly, "not to say that to you first. Because I was afraid it was too fast, and I was afraid you were still deciding, and I did not want to put something on you that you had not asked for." "You can put it on me," he said. "I am asking." "I love you," she said, and the steadiness of her voice when she said it made it feel like a vow, which it was in a way. It was a second kind of vow, less formal than the one they had spoken in the church, but perhaps more considered, because it had been earned over months of cooking and talking at midnight tables and organizing valley meetings and standing at kitchen windows in October light. Monroe reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had at the window in October, because he was a man who had learned what worked. "I am going to love you for a very long time," he said. "I intend to make that as interesting as possible," she said, and her eyes were bright with a feeling she was not trying to hide anymore. He laughed, which was something he had not done enough of before Frances, and she smiled, which was the smile she only had when she was genuinely happy, which was not the same as the smile she had when she was being polite, or the faint satisfaction she showed when something she had organized went correctly, but was a real and warm and generous thing that he felt like a gift every time she gave it. They were married 6 months by then, and they were in love, and redemption. Texas knew it, because when two people who have been careful and deliberate about loving each other finally stop being careful, the quality of them together changes visibly, and the town noticed it and was, on the whole, pleased. December brought cold, which in that part of Texas meant nights below freezing and days of crisp, brilliant sunshine that made the brown landscape look like it had been painted. Frances discovered that Monroe had a talent for no immediately obvious things that she had not known about before. He could play the harmonica passably well, and he did so on winter evenings by the fire in a way that was unpretentious and pleasant. And Frances would sit across from him with her knitting or her letter writing and listen. And the domestic peacefulness of those evenings was something she had not expected to find as beautiful as she did. She had grown up with a father who was not a demonstrative man, and a mother who had been warm but practical, and neither of her parents' marriage nor the examples of marriage she had observed in Abilene had given her a model for the thing she and Monroe were building, because it was not any of those things. It was its own shape, fashioned from two particular people's particular characters, and it fit them both. She told him this one evening in December, sitting by the fire. He considered it for a moment and then said, "I think that is the finest way to make a thing. Find out what shape it ought to be and build it that way, rather than trying to make it match something that was made for other people." She looked at him over her knitting needles. "You are occasionally very wise," she said. "Occasionally," he agreed, and went back to his harmonica. In January of 1879, the livery stable had a difficult week. A horse that Monroe had been boarding for a rancher named Peters came down with a respiratory illness that required significant attention and the kind of late-night vigils that Monroe undertook without complaint, but which left him worn and tired in ways he tried to hide from Frances with limited success. Frances noticed on the third night when he came in at 2 in the morning and she was sitting up reading. "How is he?" she said. "Holding," Monroe said, pulling off his coat. He looked tired in a way that went past the physical, and she recognized it as the exhaustion of a man who cared deeply about the work he did and found the suffering of animals genuinely difficult. She got up and went to the kitchen and came back with leftover coffee that she had kept warm on the stove, and she handed it to him and he took it and sat down in the chair by the fire. "Thank you," he said. "Tell me about him," she said. "The horse." He looked at her, slightly surprised. "I want to know," she said. So he told her about the Peters horse, whose name was Captain and who was 16 years old and had been a fine animal, and who was fighting with everything he had against an illness that his age made harder to beat. And Monroe talked about it with the directness of a man who does not sentimentalize but who feels things deeply. And Frances listened with the attention she gave to things she considered worth her attention, which was an attention that Monroe found wholly satisfying. Captain did not survive the week, and Monroe was quiet about it in the way he was quiet about things that cost him something, and Frances did not try to make it smaller than it was. She made his favorite supper and she sat beside him on the porch in the cold January evening, and she did not talk, just let the silence be the kind of silence that heals rather than the kind that hurts, and Monroe turned at some point and looked at her in the cold, clear night and said, "You are the best thing that has come into my life." "You sent back a yes," she said. "You made yourself available to it." "I am glad I did." "So am I," she said. "Every day, Monroe, every single day." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and when they came in, Monroe built up the fire and they sat beside it close together. And for all that the day had held something sad, the evening held something that was its own kind of precious. February came, and with it a letter from Abilene. Not from Mrs. Pierce this time, but from someone who signed herself M. Holt, and who Frances read with an expression that shifted from puzzlement to a frown that Monroe recognized as concern. She set the letter down and said, "There is a woman I knew in Abilene. Her name is Mary Holt. She married a man named Gerald Holt 4 years ago, and she has been in some difficulty." Rose said, "What kind of difficulty?" Frances was quiet for a moment, deciding how to say it. "The kind that is common and that no one talks about enough," she said. "Gerald Holt is not a good husband." Monroe understood what she was saying without her saying it plainly. "What does she need?" "She needs to leave," Frances said. "But she has nowhere to go and no money of her own and 2 children who are 4 and 6 years old." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We have a spare room." Frances looked at him. "Not forever necessarily," he said, "but for as long as it takes for her to find her footing, if she wants to come." Frances looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was beyond the slight widening of the eyes, that was something full and real and a little overwhelmed. "Monroe Calloway," she said. "It is only a room," he said, though they both knew it was considerably more than that. Frances wrote back to Mary Holt that same evening. The response took 3 weeks to come, because Mary was in a situation that made the simple act of sending a letter a complicated undertaking. But it came in March, and it said yes, she would come if Frances truly meant it. She would need some time to arrange things, but she would come. Frances wrote back that she meant every word. Mary Holt arrived in Redemption on a Wednesday afternoon in April of 1879, 10 months after Frances had made the same journey. She was 26 years old, and she had her 2 children with her, a boy named Thomas who was 4 and a girl named Eliza who was 6. And she had the particular look of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and is exhausted by the carefulness. She was smaller than Frances, fair-haired and quiet-voiced, and she looked at Monroe with a wariness that he understood and was careful not to challenge. Frances met them at the stage and brought them home, and Monroe had the spare room ready with clean linen, and had cooked a pot of soup which was not his best cooking but was hot and plentiful. And Thomas immediately attached himself to Monroe's left leg with the trusting physical directness of small children, And Monroe looked down at him with an expression that Francis observed from across the room and filed quietly away. Mary Holt stayed 6 weeks in their spare room, and in that time, redemption showed her the particular kindness that small communities can offer when they choose to. And Cora Hensley gave her work at the general store, and Roy Dade quietly made certain that any communication about her whereabouts from Abilene did not produce results that would cause her distress. And Francis was the constant and practical friend that she had already been in Abilene. The kind who shows up with information and plans, rather than only sympathy. By the time Mary left, with a small amount of money she had earned at the store, and a letter of recommendation from Cora, and an address for a cousin in San Antonio who had offered her a place to stay, she looked like a different woman. Not entirely healed, because some things take longer than 6 weeks, but like someone who had remembered that she was capable. On the morning she left, she hugged Francis in the street outside the stage depot, and then she turned to Monroe and she said simply, "Thank you for the room." Monroe said, "Safe travel to you and the children." After the stage left, Francis took Monroe's hand on the street without any self-consciousness, in the middle of the public road in front of half the town, and Monroe looked down at their joined hands and then at her face, and she was smiling. "You are a good man," she said. "I had a good reason," he said. Summer came back to redemption, and it was hotter than the previous summer, the kind of Texas heat that presses down like a physical weight and makes the air shimmer in the middle of the day. The livery stable expanded. Monroe had taken on a young man named Eli Marsh as an assistant, a quiet 18-year-old from a farm 40 miles east who needed work, and who proved to have a genuine gift with horses and a willingness to learn that Monroe valued. Frances continued her twice-weekly lessons, which had expanded from 2 families to 6, and she had written twice to the county education board about the possibility of a proper schoolhouse funding arrangement for families who could not pay the full fees. And though the first letter had received no reply, the second had received a cautious response, suggesting that the matter was under review. Which was not a victory, but was the particular kind of not a defeat that experienced advocates recognize as the first movement of a long process. She told Monroe about it at supper. "They wrote back," she said. "What did they say?" "They said they would review the matter." She poured the coffee. "Which means they would rather ignore it, but they have realized that someone is going to keep writing, and they had better appear to be considering it." Monroe smiled. He smiled more these days. It had surprised him how much of that change was connected to Frances. Not that she made him artificially cheerful, but that her presence made the world feel more interesting and less empty, which had the effect of making him more genuinely pleased by things. "How many letters are you prepared to write?" he said. "As many as are required," she said. "I have written to the families in the valley as well, asking for signatures on a petition. If they see 20 families asking together, it is harder to dismiss than one woman writing repeatedly." "You are going to win that," Monroe said. "Eventually," she said. "These things take time, but yes, I believe I am." He believed it too, because he had watched her work and he understood now what ungovernable actually meant when it was applied to Frances Lockhart. It did not mean wild or unreasonable. It meant that she was a woman who could not be managed by the ordinary methods of dismissal and condescension and delay, because she had an iron patience and a strategic intelligence, and a commitment to causes she believed in that no amount of institutional resistance was going to wear down. He thought about the men who had described her in those letters. He thought about how the word ungovernable had been a warning, how they had meant it to precede a refusal, how they had gone to women like Mrs. Pierce expecting to be helped toward a more manageable choice. He thought about sitting in his office and reading that word and feeling, instead of the warned-off caution the writer had intended, a very specific and growing interest. He was grateful every day that he was the kind of man who had been interested rather than frightened. On the evening of Frances's birthday, the 9th of September, 1879, a warm evening with the last of the summer heat in it, but a promise of the coming autumn in the way the light fell. Monroe did something that he had been planning for 2 weeks. He had asked Cora Hensley and Roy Dade and their wives to come to supper, and he had cooked the meal himself, which was an undertaking that Frances found suspicious when she came home from a lesson to find him in the kitchen with an apron on and a look of concentrated determination. "What are you doing?" she said from the doorway. "Cooking supper," he said. "Your birthday supper. Please go and sit in the front room." She went, with the faint smile she had when she was amused and touched in equal parts. The supper was beef roast, which Monroe had managed adequately, and biscuits, which were acceptable, and apple pie from Cora, who had baked it as her contribution to the evening, and had tried to put cinnamon in the crust at Frances's mention of Mrs. Delgado's recipe, which she had gotten from Frances herself over one of their Sunday afternoon coffees. There were 6 of them at the table, Monroe and Frances, Roy Dade and his wife Clara, and Cora and her brother who was visiting from Austin. And the evening was full of the particular pleasure of a small gathering among people who are genuinely fond of each other, with good food and honest conversation and laughter that comes easily. After supper, when Cora and Clara had taken the dishes to the kitchen over Frances's mild protest, Monroe reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box. Frances looked at the box. "Your wedding ring was my mother's," Monroe said, "and I was glad you were willing to wear it, but I wanted to give you something that was chosen specifically for you." She opened the box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small garnet, deep red and clear, nothing extravagant but precisely and obviously chosen, the kind of thing that someone picks when they know the person they are buying for. "Garnet," she said. "The man at the jeweler in Abilene who I wrote to describe you said garnet. He said it was for people who had fire in them." She looked up from the ring to his face, and the birthday candlelight caught the wet brightness of her eyes that she did not bother trying to blink away. "Monroe," she said. "I know you said once you did not need jewelry," he said. "This is not jewelry. This is a statement of a fact about who you are." She let him put it on her hand, over the plain band she already wore, and she looked down at them together and then back at him. And then she did something that still, after more than a year of marriage, had the power to completely unmoor him in the best possible way. She put both her hands on his face, right there at the dinner table with Cora and Clara and Roy Dade and Roy's opinion all within earshot, and she kissed him with a directness and a tenderness that were both entirely her. "Happy birthday to me," she said, against his mouth. "Happy birthday," he said. Behind them, from the kitchen doorway, Cora made a sound that might have been a sniffle. Autumn of 1879 was when Frances told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning before he left for the stable in the kitchen over the first coffee of the day. She set her cup down and said, "I believe I am with child," in the same voice she used to report on the progress of her letter-writing campaign or the condition of the garden, and Monroe, who had been standing by the window with his own cup, went completely still. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that careful expression she had when she was waiting to understand how he would respond to something, the expression that was a remnant of the habit of a woman who had learned not to assume that other people would receive the things she said well. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her against him and held her, careful but firm, and she laughed into his shoulder, surprised by the quickness of it. "I take it you are pleased," she said. "I am beyond pleased," he said, into her hair. "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been feeling unwell in the mornings for 3 weeks, but it is improving." I wanted to be certain before I said anything. He pulled back enough to look at her face. 3 weeks. I did not want to say it and then be wrong. "Frances," he said, and the way he said her name at that particular moment had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life, a whole conversation in 2 syllables. She reached up and touched his cheek. "We are building something," she said. "We are," he said. "We have been since the beginning." The winter of 1879 passed gently, or as gently as a Texas winter can, with Frances's pregnancy progressing smoothly and Monroe's careful attentiveness, calibrated to be supportive without being suffocating, which was a balance he managed with the same patience and attentiveness he brought to everything else. He built her a better chair. He found a wider, more padded armchair at an estate sale 60 miles away and had it brought back in the wagon, and he set it by the fire in the place where her usual chair had been, and Frances sat in it for the first time and looked up at him and shook her head slowly. "You could have simply asked me if I wanted a more comfortable chair," she said. "You would have said you were fine," he said, "because I was fine. Now you are more comfortable," he said, and went back to his harmonica. She sat in the fine armchair by the fire for the rest of the winter with her knitting and her letters and her journal, and she would not have told Monroe that the chair was more comfortable than the old one if it cost her her independence, which of course it would not. So eventually, in March, she looked up from her letter writing and said, "This is an excellent chair." He lowered his harmonica and said, "I am glad to hear it. I am not going to make a habit of conceding points to you," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I appreciate the ones you do concede." Their son was born on the 7th of June, 1880, on a hot Tuesday afternoon, attended by the town's doctor and Cora Hensley, who held Frances's hand throughout with a grip that Frances matched and possibly exceeded, and Monroe, who paced the front room of the house with a focused anxiety that he could not entirely control. The baby's first sound was a cry that was robust and indignant, the kind of cry that announces a person of strong opinions, and Monroe, who heard it from the front room and came immediately to the bedroom door to wait for permission to enter, said later that it was the finest sound he had ever heard. They named the boy James William Calloway. James for Monroe's father, William for Frances's father, William Lockhart, who had been a farmer and a reader of books and the first person to teach Frances that having opinions was a virtue rather than a flaw. James William was 8 pounds and healthy and had, according to Cora Hensley, who was not a woman to say things she did not mean, the Calloway look about the eyes and the Lockhart look about the jaw, which combination Cora predicted would make him either very charming or very difficult, and possibly both. Monroe held him in the hour after the birth and stood at the bedroom window with this small, complete, indignant person in his arms, and he felt a love that was of a different texture than the love he had for Frances, but was equally vast, and he understood with complete clarity why the thing he and Frances had been building together was what it was. Frances watched him from the bed, tired and fierce and wholly herself, and when he turned from the window and looked at her, she held out her arms, and he brought the baby to her, and the three of them were together in the evening light of Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1880, and everything in the world that mattered was in that room. Eli Marsh, the young man Monroe had taken on at the stable, had in the months following his employment developed in unexpected and pleasing ways. He was now 19, and he had grown from a shy and uncertain boy into someone with a quiet confidence about him that Monroe recognized because it looked something like what he himself had been at that age, before life had had the opportunity to show him his own capabilities. Eli was also, Monroe had observed with some amusement, deeply in the process of falling in love with the schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Briggs, who had come to Redemption in early 1880 to take the position at the newly properly funded schoolhouse, whose funding was the result of Frances's letter-writing campaign finally bearing fruit the previous autumn. Clara Briggs was 20, dark-eyed and composed, with a directness that reminded Monroe of someone, and she and Eli had a courtship that was conducted largely through the medium of Eli showing up at the schoolhouse on various pretexts, and Clara allowing this with a serenity that suggested she found it acceptable. Monroe and Frances watched this with the fond attention of people who have a particular understanding of the arc of the thing and find it pleasing. "He reminds me of you," Frances said to Monroe one evening, watching Eli walk past the house for the third time that week in the direction of the school. "He is better looking than I was at 19, Monroe said. "You were perfectly fine looking at 31, Francis said. "I noticed when I got off the stage." Monroe looked at her. "You told me I was taller than you imagined." "That was a comment on your height," she said. "I noticed the rest separately." Monroe laughed. He laughed readily now, and Frances still found it one of her favorite sounds, the particular quality of Monroe Calloway's laughter, which was rare enough to feel like a gift when it came. James was 3 months old when Monroe sat down one Sunday evening with the household accounts and the livery stable records, and did the arithmetic he had been working toward for 6 months. He set the papers on the table and went to find Frances, who was in the garden in the late summer evening with James in a basket beside her while she pulled weeds with the one-handed efficiency she had developed since the baby's arrival. "I would like to talk to you about something," he said. She looked up. "Something good or something difficult?" "Something good, I believe," he said. "An idea." She picked up the basket with James in it and followed him inside. He spread the papers on the table and she sat down across from him, and he explained the idea, which was that the livery stable had done well enough over the past 2 years that there was a genuine possibility of expanding it, adding a blacksmith operation which there was clear demand for in Redemption, because the nearest working blacksmith was 12 miles away, and the town had grown enough that the absence was increasingly inconvenient. "Eli has some experience with smithing," Monroe said. "His father was a farrier. If we build the smithy, he could run it, and I can pay him a proper wage, and the investment would repay itself within 2 years at current demand." Frances looked at the figures. She was good with numbers, which Monroe had discovered in the first months of their marriage and which had proven useful in various practical ways. She studied the projections he had made. "You have conservative estimates here," she said. "If the rail spur does come through the valley, and there is still talk of it, now that Hale is gone, the demand could be considerably higher." "I did not want to plan on optimistic numbers," Monroe said. "No, that is correct. But it means your margin is probably better than this." She pointed at the paper. "Have you spoken to Eli?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." She looked up from the papers. "This is a good idea," she said. "The town needs a smithy and Eli is a good young man. Do you want me to draw up a proper proposal so you can present it to the bank clearly?" "I can do it." "You can," she said, "but I am faster and I enjoy it. Let me do it." He smiled. "All right." She pulled the papers toward her side of the table and found a clean sheet and began making notes. James made a small sound from his basket that was not quite awake and not quite asleep, the contented settling of a healthy baby, and Monroe looked at him, and then at Francis writing rapidly and neatly at the table, and the sensation in his chest was so large and warm and complete that it required a moment to simply be felt. He got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee, and when he came back, Frances had 2 pages of notes and was chewing the end of her pen with the focused distraction of a woman deep in the pleasure of a problem she likes. He set the coffee beside her without interrupting, and she reached for it without looking up. "Thank you," she said, and kept writing. The blacksmith addition was built in the spring of 1881, and Eli Marsh was officially made the Redemption smithy keeper, and on the day the first work came through the new smithy, a rancher's wagon axle that needed reinforcing, Monroe and Francis and baby James stood in the doorway of the livery and watched Eli work with the confidence and capability of someone who had found the thing he was made for, and Francis said, "You gave him that," and Monroe said, "He gave himself that. I just built him the room." Clara Briggs and Eli Marsh married in June of 1881, in the same small Baptist church where Monroe and Francis had been married 3 years before, with the same Reverend Holt officiating and considerably more of the town in attendance, because by now Eli was known and liked, and Clara was beloved by every family in the valley whose children she taught with patience and skill and genuine care. Francis stood at the reception in the churchyard in the summer heat and watched Eli Marsh look at his new wife, with an expression that was open and terrified and completely certain all at once, and she remembered a stage door opening and a dusty Main Street, and a man in a hat who had assessed her with quiet interest rather than the wariness she had come to expect. And she found Monroe at her elbow a moment later, as if he had followed the direction of her thoughts. And he put his hand at the small of her back in the simple, uncalculated way he had of touching her that she had never grown tired of. "Happy," he said. "Enormously," she said. He pressed a light kiss to her temple, right there in the church yard with everyone present, and she tilted into him slightly. And it was the gesture of two people who have been together long enough that their bodies have developed their own grammar of closeness. The summer of 1881 passed, and in the autumn, Frances discovered she was expecting their second child, which she announced this time over supper rather than over the morning coffee, and Monroe reached across the table and took her hand exactly the way he had in the months before they knew they loved each other, and she laughed. "You keep doing that," she said. "It works," he said. "It does," she said. The second child was born in April of 1882, a girl they named Eleanor Frances Calloway, Ellie, who was born with her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's quiet assessment of the world around her, and who James, now nearly 2 years old and very opinionated about the new arrival, decided was both acceptable and his personal property. Monroe held Eleanor on the porch in the spring evening while Frances rested, with James sitting on the porch step playing determinedly with a carved horse that Monroe had made him in the winter, and the air smelled of the blooming things in the kitchen garden, and the smoke from the forge that was visible at the edge of town, and a neighbor's dog was barking in the middle distance, and the whole ordinary texture of the life Monroe had built was present in that moment. He looked down at Eleanor, who was looking up at him with the particular focused gravity of new babies, and he said, quietly, so only she could hear, "Your mother is the finest person I have ever known. I intend to make sure you know that." Eleanor appeared to consider this, and then did something with her face that might have been her earliest attempt at an expression. Frances had a letter in the autumn of 1882 from Mrs. Adelaide Pierce in Abilene. The letter was characteristically practical and warm in equal parts, and it reported that Mrs. Pierce was well, and that the rooming house she had helped to run before her retirement was under new management, and that Abilene was growing and loud and occasionally maddening. At the end of the letter, Mrs. Pierce wrote, "I received a letter last month from a young woman in Dodge City, Kansas, who is in something of the same situation that you were in when I found you a match. I wonder if you might know of anyone. I wrote to you first, I confess, because I thought you might have thoughts." Frances read this and then read it again and then set the letter down on the table with an expression that Monroe, watching from across the room, recognized immediately. "What?" he said. She picked up the letter and brought it to him and pointed at the relevant paragraph. He read it, then he looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking," she said, "that I know a good man." Monroe waited. "Silas Greer's nephew," she said. "Lewis. He came to visit in August. He is 29 years old and he has been farming his own land east of here for 4 years, and he is one of the kindest men I have ever met, and he is deeply lonely, and I noticed it immediately." Monroe thought about Lewis Greer, who was indeed one of the kindest men in the valley and who had spent his visit in August talking at length to Silas and somewhat less to other people, with the particular social reserve of someone who has been solitary long enough that conversation in groups feels effortful. "You are going to write to Mrs. Pierce," Monroe said. "I am going to write to Mrs. Pierce," Frances confirmed. "You are going to describe Lewis Greer honestly," Monroe said. "I am going to describe him as he is," Frances said, "which is gentle and hardworking and not particularly easy to get to know quickly but worth the effort. And the young woman in Dodge City, I will ask Mrs. Pierce to tell me about her first," Frances said, "and if she seems like someone who would value those qualities, I will make the suggestion." Monroe looked at his wife, sitting at the table with her pen already in hand, and that purposeful set to her jaw that meant she had decided a thing and was proceeding. He thought about the letter that had come to him in the spring of 1878, with its honest warning at the end. He thought about what it meant to receive the truth about a person rather than the presentation of a person, and what kind of courage it took to send it. "Tell her," he said, "that Lewis is a man worth sending a yes back to." Frances looked up from her paper and met his eyes, and something passed between them that was recognition and gratitude and the particular deep warmth of two people who have built something together and know its value because they know what it costs. "I will," she said. She wrote the letter that evening, and Monroe sat across from her at the table, the same table where they had sat at midnight in the first months of their marriage, the candle between them, and read a borrowed almanac while she wrote. And when she looked up to ask him to verify a detail about Lewis's land acreage, he answered without looking up from his page, and she went back to writing. The fire burned low, and James slept in his room and Eleanor slept in her cradle, and the Texas night was cool and full of stars. Frances finished the letter and sealed it and set it by the door to go to the post in the morning, and she came back to the table and sat down and looked at Monroe, who looked up from his almanac. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said, "about the first letter, the one Mrs. Pierce wrote about me." "I remember it," he said. "She wrote that I had been described as fierce and ungovernable in every letter written on my behalf. She said that men had used those words as a warning." "Yes," he said. "You sent back one word." "Yes," he said. "Were you frightened, at any point, even a little?" Monroe set the almanac down. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was nervous," he said. "When you came off the stage, I was standing there with my hat in my hands and thinking that a woman that's certain of herself was going to look at me and see through me in about 30 seconds. "I did," she said. "I know," he said. "But what I saw when you looked at me was that you were looking for something real, not something that would make you feel smaller, just something real." "That is what I was looking for," she said. "And I thought," Monroe said, "that if a woman like that was willing to come here and try to build something with me, then the least I could do was be exactly what I am and see if that was enough." "It was more than enough," Frances said, and her voice was the steady voice she used when she was saying something that she meant completely. "So were you," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they sat there in the quiet house at the end of a day that was one of the thousands of ordinary days they had built a life out of. And the ordinariness of it was the point, was the thing, was the accumulation that becomes a life. And Frances Calloway, who had been Frances Lockhart, knew this, and was grateful for it in the particular way of someone who had understood scarcity, and who therefore understood, in her bones, what abundance felt like. The years moved through redemption the way the seasons did, with their own rhythms and their own demands. The rail spur came through the valley in 1884, as the rumors had long predicted, and Monroe's blacksmith addition proved its worth tenfold as the demands of the construction crews, and the new traffic meant more work than Eli could manage alone, and Monroe took on a second man, a former railroad worker named Davis Cobb, who had a talent with metal and an easygoing quality that balanced Eli's intensity well. Frances's letter-writing campaign had by this time produced not only the proper schoolhouse funding, but a small library of donated books kept in the church annex, which was not grand but was a start, and which she maintained with the same steady organizational will she brought to everything she believed in. James started at the school in 1884, at the age of 4, which Clara Briggs said was a year early, but which she allowed because James Calloway clearly had his mother's intelligence and would be more trouble bored than enrolled. He sat in the front row and asked questions with a frequency that made Clara occasionally look at the ceiling for patience, and Frances received reports of this with an expression of carefully controlled pride. "He is exactly like you," Monroe told her. "He is going to be considerably more difficult than me," she said. "He has your patience combined with my opinions. That is a dangerous combination." "He is also kind," Monroe said. "That matters more than the rest of it." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it does." Eleanor, at 2, was an entirely different kind of person. Where James was quick and verbal, and always in the middle of something, Alina was observant and quiet and deeply attached to the horses at the stable, in a way that Monroe recognized as a professional calling in embryo. By the time she was 3, she was following Monroe to the stable on Saturday mornings with the seriousness of an apprentice, and Monroe was teaching her the horses' names and their habits, and she was learning them all with an accuracy that he found remarkable. "She is going to end up running the stable," Francis said one Saturday evening when Monroe came home with Alina asleep on his shoulder, worn out from a full day of horse supervision. "She is welcome to it," Monroe said. "You would be all right with that," he looked at her. "My father left it to me. I intend to leave it to whoever wants it most. If that is Alina, I will be glad." Francis smiled, and it was the full and generous smile, the one she had when she was genuinely happy. "Louis Greer's letter came today," she said. "He has met the young woman Mrs. Pierce suggested. And he says she is remarkable and terrifying in equal parts, and he is not sure what to do." Monroe laughed. "Tell him to send back a yes," he said. Francis shook her head. "I already did," she said. Monroe transferred the sleeping Alina carefully to the armchair by the fire, the good armchair that had been there since 1879, and Francis tucked a blanket around her daughter with the automatic efficiency of a woman who has been doing this for 3 years, and they stood for a moment looking at her, this small, serious person who loved horses and had her father's eyes, and then Francis leaned her head against Monroe's shoulder. "I keep thinking about what my life would have been," she said. "Don't," he said. "Not in a sad way," she said. "Only in the way that makes you appreciate what actually happened, the road I did not take and what I found when I took this one instead." He put his arm around her and she settled against him, the way she had on the cold January porch after Captain died, the way she did by the fire in the evenings, the comfortable and particular fit of two people who have been beside each other long enough that standing together feels like the natural posture of the world. "I found you," he said simply. "You found someone who had been called ungovernable 4 times, she said, with the slight dryness she used when she was being funny about herself. "I found the best thing of my life," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you know what I found when I came off that stage?" "What?" "A man who was standing there with his hat in his hands," she said, "and who looked at me like I was exactly what he had been waiting for, not like I was the problem that had arrived, like I was the answer." Monroe felt the weight and warmth of that in the way he felt important things, fully and without defense. "You were," he said. She tilted her head up and kissed him, soft and brief, and full of everything they had become to each other in 7 years of building a life in Redemption, Texas, in the extraordinary, ordinary landscape of the Wild West, under the enormous sky that went on forever in every direction. In the summer of 1885, on an evening in July, Monroe and Francis sat on the porch of their house in the long Texas twilight. James was 7, and Alina was 5, and they were playing in the yard with the kind of concentrated childhood energy that belongs to summer evenings, and the yard smelled of the kitchen garden and the warm earth and the distant clean smell of the creek. Eli Marsh and Clara had a baby of their own now, a boy named Henry, and Louis Greer had married his young woman from Dodge City, whose name was Sarah, and who proved to be exactly as remarkable and terrifying as Louis's letter had suggested, and who Francis liked immediately and profoundly, and who was already, in the way of women with strong characters, becoming part of the fabric of the valley. Monroe had a glass of water because the heat made coffee impossible after 4 in the afternoon, and Francis had her journal open on her knee, though she was not writing in it, was only watching James and Alina in the yard with the attentiveness of a woman who finds the specific texture of her children deeply interesting. "I am going to write a letter," she said. "To whom?" Monroe said. "To the state legislature," she said, "about property rights for women. I have been reading about the movement in the eastern states, and I believe there is an argument to be made based on the conditions specific to frontier territories. Women here work the land. They run businesses. They should be able to hold property in their own names without a husband's name on the deed." Monroe was quiet for a moment, watching James attempt to teach a leaner the proper way to throw a rope, which a leaner was receiving with polite tolerance and then doing completely differently. "I will sign it," he said. "If they need a man's signature to take it seriously, you will have mine." She looked at him. "That is exactly the problem with the current system and also the most generous offer you could make," she said. "I know," he said. "Both things can be true." She reached over and took his hand. His hand was calloused and warm from the work and the sun, the hand of a man who had been doing honest physical labor in this landscape for the better part of 20 years, and she held it the way she had held it 1,000 times, with the grip of a woman who held things she valued without loosening. "Do you remember," she said, "what Mrs. Pierce wrote about me?" "I remember every word of that letter," he said. "She said she would rather I be known honestly than pleasantly," Francis said. "She was afraid that the truth of me would scare away anyone worth having." "She was wrong about that," Monroe said. "The truth of you is the thing that was worth having." Francis looked at him with those gray-green eyes in the gold of the Texas evening, and she was 30 years old now, and the years had not softened her exactly but had deepened her, had added layers beneath the fierceness that were still there and always would be. "She was right about one thing," Francis said. "She said if you wanted a partner, I was the finest one she knew. Was she right about that?" "You are the finest partner I have ever known," Monroe said, without hesitation. "You are the finest person I have ever known." She squeezed his hand. And in the yard James had given up on teaching the rope throw, and a leaner had picked the rope back up, and was attempting her own version which, by the time Monroe looked, was working considerably better than James's method, which James was examining with the particular irritation of the older sibling who has been outperformed. Francis followed his eyes and saw the same thing, and they looked at each other, and both of them were laughing at the same moment. And the evening held it all, the laughter, and the children, and the smell of the garden and the enormous sky, and the life that they had made, the life that had come from one letter and one honest word and two people who had been willing to find out what was real. In the last warmth of the day, in Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1885, Monroe Calloway and Francis Lockhart Calloway sat on their porch, and the world was good and theirs and sufficient and full, and everything that mattered was within reach, and nothing that they had built together had been built on anything but the truth, and it held. It held the way only true things hold, completely, and for a very long time.